Hi everyone, thank you for coming tonight. I want to welcome Jennifer Rubin. I'm very excited to host her. You all know who she is, so this introduction doesn't need to be long at all. In fact, I was actually just going to say, here's Jennifer Rubin, but I have a small story to tell. So my dad and I, with my father, we argued from how to make toast to Israel. Nonstop. We loved it. We annoyed each other, it was heated, it was passionate, but we loved it. And so, a long time ago, over a decade ago, certainly, I noticed he was stronger in his arguments about his positions about Israel. And I wondered, like, where are you getting this? Because I had a new ace. You know, who's that? He goes, Jennifer Rubin. So I had to find Jennifer Rubin in a magazine called Commentary. And so my first experience with Jennifer's writing was I didn't agree with her. She's so formidable. Right? Very provocative. She made me much smarter. She made my father smarter too. And so that was good for the thing we do, like to argue. And what Jennifer did for us is she provoked us. And provocation is a good thing I want to emphasize to the students. The greatest things I read provoke. Yes, I love reading what I agree with. Oh, yes, why didn't I say that? Yeah, all the time, right? But I didn't. But what really gets me saying things is when I'm provoked. Whether I agree or not, provocative writers are really good. And because provocation creates discussion. And this takes us to Jennifer Rubin, because democracy needs discussion. And so now I'm going to turn it to you. As the rabbis of the Talmud direct, discussion shall never cease in this life or the next. And thank you, Jennifer Rubin, for always ensuring discussion never ceases.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the college for having me, and to my great battlefield guys. I don't know if they're here or not, Brandon and Emma, which was a wonderful afternoon in one of my favorite places. And the timing couldn't be more fortuitous. If you want to read my column tomorrow, I'll talk about a bit of what I'm going to talk about tonight, which is the echo of Gettysburg even today in our current politics. A week ago, President Biden spoke about the threat to democracy posed by extreme authoritarian forces. He is no Abraham Lincoln, as even he would acknowledge, but the articulated threat to democracy is remarkably consistent to what this country has always faced. And that is a certain segment of the population wants to redefine America. And by that, I mean, America, Biden says it himself, is an idea, it's a creed. All men are created. It is based upon a creed, a philosophy, not a language, not a religion, not a race, not a shared national history, because we come from everywhere. But it is based on this ideal. To certain groups of people throughout American history, that has been a threat or a inconvenience, that they wish to redefine America in a way that benefits themselves. That they want to define or redefine America as a Christian nation. And it is true that most Americans are Christian, but it is also an anathema to what the founders devised, that we have no state religion and we have no identity that is tied to religion, be it Christianity or any other religion. And statistically, if you look now, the largest growing group is what I call none of the above, people who ascribe to no religion. So, who are these people? Why have they played this role? How did we get to where we are? And where are we going? Well, whether you call them the know-nothings from the 19th century, or the Confederacy and the Lost Cause from the late 19th, earlier 20th century, or you call them the MAGA Republicans, not all Republicans. This is a group of people that essentially reject America as a pluralistic democracy, that they look upon diversity as alien. They seek to define real Americans, real America, you'll hear that phrase, in a way that excludes not only racial minorities, not only religious minorities, but whole swaths of the country, that urban people, cosmopolitan people, elites, highly educated people are alien to America. And it's a remarkably consistent pattern that you've seen from the last 150, 160, 200 years. You would really have to be intentionally, deliberately obtuse not to appreciate that there is a connective tissue between the people who formulated the Lost Cause and the MAGA Republicans. No, MAGA Republicans are not advocating for slavery. It's clear about that. But think of the similarities. They both harken back to a mystical past. They both perceive whites as victims. They both perceive a degradation of society that happened with modernity and an aspiration to some agrarian lifestyle. They seek to rewrite history, whether it is erecting statues that lionize the Confederate generals, or it is trying to police what teachers are teaching in the public schools about the history of discrimination in the country and the civil rights movement. The effort to use history and misuse history and rewrite history is absolutely central to the endeavor. And it's not only in this country. If you look at authoritarians around the world, it is critical to shape history, to shape people's collective memory, and to postulate themselves as victims. And it's a little peculiar because you think about it, they ascribe to lead the country, to be the ones in power. Why would victims think they have the right to power? And it is this duality of they think of themselves as the rightful heirs of our national heritage, and at the same time that they've been terribly abused. And we remain, even though we do have a large segment of none of the aboves, we remain among industrial societies one of the most religious and religiously observant, and church attendance is higher here, certainly than it is in Europe. And yet they postulate that Christianity is under attack. So what does that get them? Why is that? And again, I go back to the Lost Cause because it is so similar in many ways to what we are experiencing now. In order to assert one's superiority, in order to say some Americans are not really as American as I am, you need to make sure that your group is without moral fault, that you are better than people, that you are more benevolent than people, that you have not committed a national sin. And you see where this is going, because in order to do that, you have to make the Civil War about something other than slavery. In order to do this, you have to make the teaching of America something that excludes Jim Crow and racial discrimination and the ongoing battle for equal rights. So it is the desire to maintain control and power coupled with a need to recreate a history in which you are the innocent and others are somehow morally at fault, certainly not representative of culture. And there's something else at play here. When an authoritarian group seeks to define the opposition, the other, they postulate that they are in the midst of an existential crisis. the stakes have to be really, really high for them to get their way and for them to want to assume power. So in the South, it was their way of life, slavery, was being threatened. And now you hear that America is having a Flight 93 moment. They refer to the plane that went down in Pennsylvania on 9/11. They postulate that Western civilization is at stake. Why is this extreme language? Why do they have this sense of panic? And the answer is, with panic and with chaos comes the desire for a strong leader, comes a lack of patience with democracy, which is a messy, confusing, frustrating, difficult way to operate a country. And one of the things they will point to, whether it was the Weimar Republic in Germany, whether it was the AGA movement today, those people in Washington are corrupt. Democracy doesn't work. I alone can fix it. And the sense that these problems are really very easy. Everyone is lacking nerve. Everyone is lacking the sense, except for me, is the totalitarian handle. So if you combine a threat to your entire way of life, it has to be a really big threat, then you can justify a non-democratic process, and worse, whatever tactics you use are then justified. Because these people are such a threat, it doesn't matter if you lie, it doesn't matter if you subvert institutions, it doesn't matter if you resort to violence. All of that is justified for this higher good of preserving a certain mindset, a certain outlook on the country. And when you look at the components of what we are going through now, what's fascinating is completely American and yet part of the international crisis that we are going through. It is absolutely emblematic of America for all the reasons I just spoke about, for race, for a sense of a desire to push back on, to eliminate diversity, desire to use the state to enforce religious values. But we are also part of an international phenomenon where democracies are really under assault. And why is that? Every country has its particularities, just like we do. But I think there are some common themes that explain why democracies are having such a hard go of it of late. One is that with the technological revolution, with computers, with the scientific innovations, the gaps between rich and poor are getting more and more extreme. And the gaps between the educated people competent to be successful in that type of economy and the people not gets wider and wider. So obviously frustration and resentment sets in. We have had huge demographic and population shifts in this country. So we have hollowed out cities in the Rust Belt, and we have burgeoning new cities in Texas and the rest of the Sun Belt. And the people left behind feel left behind. And the sense of being denied something, deprived of something, something that was mine has been taken from me, is a pervasive problem in all of these democracies. They no longer feel that their values are respected. Many of these people are quite religiously conservative, religiously observant, and it's the same pattern everywhere. Whether you look at Brexit and who was the Remain and who was the Leave, whether you look at the voting in the French election, you'll see the same patterns. Rural, religious, older people are voting for right-wing candidates. Cosmopolitan, younger people, cities, industrial areas are voting for center right, center left, center, however you want to describe it. And it's not the policy prescriptions that matter. It is not, I have a better health care plan than the other guy. It's not, I have a solution to high unemployment. It is a worldview. It is a ability to connect with people who feel aggrieved. That is what these people thrive on. We're seeing it in Italy. We're about to have an election September 25th, a far right conglomeration as well. So although we're uniquely American, we're not all that unique. And we share this challenge with far right elements around the world, which have gotten extremely sophisticated. They have been able to use the internet. They have been able to create news silos so their people are insulated from facts and information that would undermine their worldview. They are extremely good at emotionalizing, at making politics an irrational rather than a rational exercise. Here appeals to fear, to resentment, to anger. Why do they always seem to be shouting? Because they're angry, and you should be angry too. And this is not anything to be rationalized about. This is to be to form the mob, quite literally in our case on January 6th, into a force that's going to promote them. And once you have this in play, it affects and infects virtually all institutions. You will see a corruption of the courts. You'll see a corruption of the bureaucracy. You'll see a corruption of the scientific community, because suddenly they become people in service to the state. I was speaking to a number of OBGYN doctors, hospital administrators over the last month or so, talking to them about the abortion decision. And they said something that was very interesting. They said, when a profession like the medical profession becomes an agent of the state to enforce a state responsibility, then you have a collapse of a professional obligation that you have to the individual. Then whatever professional training you have, whatever relationship of trust, whatever responsibility you take for the health and well-being of that person, becomes in conflict with now you're acting at the behest of the state. And I never really thought about it that way. I thought about, well, yeah, maybe in Soviet times, you had the Soviet scientists who were fudging the facts, and you had the Soviet historians who were fudging the facts, and you had Pravda that was fudging the facts. It doesn't look so strange anymore, does it? Because we see echoes of that today. So that depressingly brings us to the present. But people ask me all the time, what do we do? They won't listen to us. They're not logical. All they do is watch a certain news cable station all day long. And the answer is, what I write about in the book, the answer is more democracy. That following the 2016 election, people got very shaken and very upset. And the thesis of my book is those were primarily women who got very upset and shaken. That we had elected someone who abused women, was disrespectful towards women, who had a radical agenda, and suddenly their neighbors, their friends, their countrymen had voted for this person. This was not the country they thought it was. What is happening here? The country's gone mad. And so after a few weeks of commiserating and talking to friends, what does that mean? They formed new organizations. Indivisible was a project of a husband and wife, a former labor organizer. And they decided to put a Google document out on the internet to explain to people how you organize yourself, how you run a meeting, how you discuss issues, how you designate community people to do outreach. And within moments, they got 17,000 responses. They were on to something. And pretty soon it was in the millions. And that's one organization, one example. one of the things I found in my book was hundreds of these organizations, 2, 3, 4, 5,000 people. People who had never been political. Some people didn't even know who their congressperson was. They certainly didn't know who their local representatives were. And suddenly they were put in a situation where the network of people was their response to what they saw as a national tragedy. That if we can work together, if we can agitate together, if we can win elections together, if we can educate together, we don't have to accept this as a fait accompli. And this, of course, is the core understanding of democracy. It is, there are no permanent winners, there are no permanent losers. It is the act of continually organizing, voting, participating in a democratic society. And as a result of their activities, we spawned all sorts of these organization networks, some of them across states, some of them in neighborhoods. They, for the first time, went out and found candidates to run on a Democratic slate in counties, Chesterfield County in Virginia. It's a relatively conservative county. The women of Chesterfield County decided we're going to get organized. We're going to run a slate of candidates finally that to compete with the Republicans. We're going to interview candidates. We're going to give them our approval or not our approval. We're going to volunteer on campaigns. And we're going to change the politics of Chesterfield County. And they did. And to me, that story was so inspiring and such a useful reminder that the only way to combat authoritarianism is not by coming up with your own demagogue. It's not coming up with your own celebrity candidate. It is not trying to argue with people who are really trapped at this point in a certain prism and certain worldview. It is to engage in democracy. That democracy is a activity, not a thing. It is a obligation of citizenship. And that a way to undo these things is through democratic organization. Let's take a recent example. Supreme Court came out with a decision in Dunlop's. Whether you like it, don't like it, there was a very strong reaction to it, a backlash to it. And lo and behold, there's a vote coming up in Kansas, not exactly blue America. And what the activists did there was to organize like crazy. They said, you know, if we can make this close, it'll send a big message to other legislators, to the nation at large, that this is not an acceptable state of affairs. And they got very sophisticated in messaging. They didn't make it a Democrat versus Republican fight. They made it a freedom versus government fight, a issue of individual choice, of individual self-realization, of individual direction. And to the shock of everyone, they not only won, but they won overwhelmingly in Kansas. That is the democratic response to what you may perceive as a subversion of rights or as a turn in a direction that is not conducive to a tolerant, pluralistic democratic society. And now we're engaged in a midterm election. If there is anyone in this room who is not registered to vote, shame on you and get yourself registered. And if you're registered someplace else and you have a choice of being registered in Pennsylvania, register in Pennsylvania. It's a very important state. You're going to have some really very interesting elections coming up for governor, for senator, for other positions. And that's the way you respond. And there was some grumbling after the Dobbs decision that the president was saying to them, and the phrase went, vote harder, meaning, well, we're already voting. What do you want from us? And the answer is, you may be voting, but your job doesn't stop there as a democratic citizen, small d democratic. that it involves engaging with other people. It involves turning them out. It involves education on whatever issue you have. And that's the task ahead. Is it difficult? Is it tiresome? Is it at times frustrating? Yes. But no one is sending you out to die at Cemetery Ridge. No one is asking you to take up arms against your fellow Americans. Can you not do this much for your country? And I think most people are saying, yes, we can do this much. It's fascinating. In 2018, among the many women who ran for election and the many first-time women candidates were a group of women who informally called themselves 5 badasses. Excuse my language. They were 5 women who had either served in the military or the CIA, some aspect of national security. Abigail Spanberger, who represents the Virginia 7th, was one of these people. She had actually been an undercover CIA operative in Europe. She had resigned from the CIA. She watched the election somewhat amazed, and she, at that time, wasn't sure who her congressperson was. She found out it was a fellow by the name of Bratt, who had defeated the prior Republican majority leader, Eric Cantor, who was extremely far right. And she said, all right, well, he's having a town hall. Let me go and listen and see what he has to say. And as she's sitting there, she realizes it's no one he's talking about. She has more knowledge than he does. She has more common sense than he does. And it is that light bulb that went on that we need to continue to turn on, that there's no special secret sauce to being a politician in America. And some of the most ill-educated and miseducated people happen to be in politics. It's a very nice cushy job if you can keep your seat. And as citizens, as educated citizens, as people with life experiences, everyone in this room has the capacity to serve in some sort of office. That may not be your choice, but the notion that politics is of a class apart from us, that they are people who have some special knowledge, some special insight, better information than the rest of us. Many of these women, because they had had a national security background, had had an intelligence background, realized this was nonsense. These people did not know what they were talking about. They ran for office, they expressed their national security credentials, and they won. A couple of them are now in very tough races, thanks to redistricting and gerrymandering. But they also kind of set an example, which is you too can do this. It's only in the last 100 years or so that people got this notion that you're going to be a politician for life, that you are going to go to Washington and the worst possible thing would be that you would lose your seat. It would be inconceivable. And that leads to a intellectual corruption and a dishonesty. Because if the only thing that matters is holding power and staying in office, you'll say and do anything. And that's the phenomenon that we've seen in the post-January 6th era. Why is it that Liz Cheney is virtually the only Republican willing to say this? It's because she's bigger fish to fry. Holding the representative slot from Wyoming is not her highest aspiration in life. It is not what she values. Whatever you think of her politics, whatever you think of her father's politics, she sees something bigger and her operations as something bigger. And that is a defense of democracy and of objective reality, frankly. That, who are you going to believe? Me or your lying eyes? That we all have seen certain events, we can all agree on certain facts, and if we're going to govern in a fantasy land, we're not going to have an accountable democracy. So, as I was writing this book, I came to a false conclusion. And I made an intellectual error that I often chide my candidates about. And that is, you assume that whatever you have and the place that you're in is going to continue indefinitely. So that's why, well, is titled "The Women Who Saved Democracy" from Donald Trump. Wrong. They spared democracy. They gave democracy a second breath, a second gasp, but we are never permanently saved. And to many of our surprise, the post-Trump years are in many respects much more injurious to democracy, much more stressful on the institutions of democracy, because you now have an aggrieved leader who is on the outside, who has challenged, tempted to bring down a democratic electoral system and remains wedded to it, and has a band of devoted followers who will believe anything he says, follow him, whatever he does. So it wasn't that 2020 was nothing, but it was an example, not the end all and be all. It was an example of the type of effort you have to put forth in order to retain a democratic system. There is a natural sense of exhaustion at some point. People get tired. People get tired of the fighting. They get tired of following the news. They get tired of listening to people who they know are lying to them, and they just want to tune out and read a good book. I get that. And the little known secret is journalists sometimes wish they could take a break as well, but you can't because your job is being in the moment. That does not mean that we need to accept a regime, a system, a movement that has endless energy, endless ambition, endless capacity to generate propaganda. It just means we have to steel ourselves for the battle. This means we have to be as tenacious in defense of democracy as they are in undermining it. It means that we have to be as tenacious in defense of a free press that accurately portrays what is going on, that does not fall prey to false balance and so whataboutism. That we too have to be able to make the case for why functional democracy is important. Why does Biden sometimes confuse, it seems, or push together a list of democratic accomplishments with his defense of democracy? It's because, as we were saying earlier, that one of the primary arguments against democracy is you're too fractious, you're too incompetent, you're too consumed with yourself and your battles to get anything done. And his response, when he says rhetorically to the country, what he said at the summit of democracy in December 2021 is, you have to show not only are these values worth defending, but that we can produce results for our people. When we go back to how did we get to where we are, part of the failure of democracies was to fulfill its promise of widespread prosperity. That prosperity, the promise of a democracy is to have a good life, that everyone has an opportunity. And when democracies turned out to be not living up to that promise, naturally people would become disaffected and naturally they would be subject or vulnerable to a demagogue. So it is as equally important that democracies produce results, do things that people like, as it is to intellectually, morally make the defense of democracy. And one of the things you see continuing in anti-democratic forces is the desire to make government chaotic. It's the desire to throw sand into the wheels, to make sure nothing gets done. And they sometimes get caught in the act of saying, we want to make sure he never gets an accomplishment. We want to make sure Barack Obama is a one-term president. We want to make sure that he doesn't get the win. That's not how democracies are supposed to operate. But that's how you delegitimize a democracy. by stalling it, throwing sand in the gears, and then portraying it as something better is out there, and that is the strong man. So once more, we have our work cut out for us. We have 60 some odd days between now and the election. Everyone always says this is the most consequential election of your time. But considering that the members of Congress and the Senate you vote for this time will be the people counting the electoral votes in 2024. And when you consider that a Republican-held Senate has candidly said that if the Democratic president has an opening on the Supreme Court, they won't hear him. How is that for a denial of political legitimacy? You can see how important it is now to secure. And when you look at the election deniers who are running for attorney general, for secretaries of state, these are the people who count the elections, who count the votes, who make the claims in court about whether there has been any impropriety. If you're going to let people who up front have already said the last election was illegitimate, they are telling you that there's only one possible outcome. They win or there's been massive cheating. And there are over 100 of these people running for offices. And I don't mean minor offices. I mean governor, secretary of state, senate, house. It is very, very dangerous to have in office people who have adopted a worldview that forces them to deny reality and uses that to undermine democracy. So we have our work cut out for us. But should you be dismayed, I'll leave you with this statistic. In this portion of the program with this statistic. There is a data and pollster by the name of Tom Bonnier, I think it's Bonnier, B-O-N-I-E-R, Bonnier, who works for an outfit called Target Smart. And how he put this together is amazing. But what he did was look at the voter registrations since the Dobbs decision came down in late June. And he narrowed in on those states that have very tight elections that are so-called swing states, Pennsylvania, Ohio. And he also looked at Kansas because we had just had this election. What did he find? That suddenly the number of people registered were overwhelmingly women and were overwhelmingly Democratic. And I immediately thought, that's what happened after 2016. That women got mad and they got concerned. And they said, we got to do something about that. And in Kansas, if you looked at the returns, 56% of that electorate was women. That's phenomenal, off the charts. However many, percentage off the mean. There are more women than men. There usually is a slight tilt, but it's 51%, 50.5%, 56%. We've never seen anything like that. And if those people are registered, and if they are voting, and if they are representing a backlash response to the Supreme Court, then it's a kind of a whole new ballgame. And moreover, the pollsters, once again, really have no clue because we don't know who's going to show up. And that's the challenge for the next 60 odd days, to show up, to organize, to make sure your friends and family, to make sure every student on this campus is registered and turns out to vote, and every faculty member and every staff member and every administrator. And if we can do that, I think we'll be okay. I do have faith in the underlying premise of democracy. And I think for the generation that students belong to, it is the best bred, most inclusive, most environmentally conscious generation we've ever had. And so if you guys turn out to vote, we'll really be in okay shape. And we're reaching the point at which the baby boomers fall off as the dominant factor, and millennials and Generation Extra, see all the rest of them move up. And that may probably save us. So if we can manage not to screw it up badly, so badly, that it's unrecognizable by the time that you reach full adulthood and participation in politics, that would be a good thing. So with that, I would love to hear questions and find out what you're thinking.
If you don't mind, I'd like to ask a question, like a personal evolution or metamorphosis, or whatever you might want to call it. When you first started with a blog to WashPost, it was called Midterm. So 2 years ago, your Twitter feed or handle, whatever it's called, identified you as a conservative. Your columns were remindedly lower tax, less regulation, small enough. You now have changed. What do you attribute this?
Great question. Well, here's a very trivial, easy answer, and then there's the real answer that you want. The very trivial answer is that the Post, for branding purposes, who I was going to be a brand, wanted to get rid of all of these other labels that many of us had on our columns. So they just wanted to be Jennifer Rubin, not Mike Turner or something else. That's the boring, silly answer. The real answer is, I don't think I've changed all that much. That I used to believe, and I still believe, in individual freedom, in a regulated marketplace, in free trade, in robust immigration, in the rule of law, in limited government. None of these are acceptable in the Republican Party anymore. There are people who call themselves conservative, but they're not conservative. They're for an overarching invasive government, and they're for dramatic, unlimited change in an unlimited path. So both temperamentally and substantively, I don't think I've changed that much. Now, there are two areas in which I think my thinking has changed, and that's because I think of events. And one is on guns, which I've come to believe that it is completely intolerable to have a society in which everyone is armed to the teeth, and it's easier to get a gun than it is to register to vote. And that unless we get that under control, we will have nonstop fighting. And that has been brought home to me regularly over the last 10 years. So I have become much more supportive of reasonable gun measures. And I think those would include background checks, that would include limitations on age. And I would, even if we could possibly get rid of them, look at banning certain types of weapons, which are weapons of war. The other area I think in which I have changed my thinking is the degree of intervention that is appropriate and necessary by government in the economy. Precisely because of the changes that I've described, we now have such income inequality, educational inequality, that it is politically unsustainable. And for the sake of democracy and for political continuity, for a functional democracy in which people feel like they have a stake, that we do need more government intervention. And there's smart government intervention, there's less smart intervention, but frankly, I was quite pleased with the Inflation Reduction Act, although it's not going to reduce inflation, I'm sorry to say, but it does things like investing in energy, which is using incentives to change people's behavior for the betterment of society. It is creating a counterweight to a pharmaceutical industry that's very big and has consolidated. And now you have a balancing force in the federal government that will be able to negotiate gun prices. I don't think these are wild, crazy ideas, and they're certainly not socialism or whatever else you speak of. Would I have been supportive of those particular things 10 years ago? Maybe not, and I would have been a lot more concerned about what they cost. I have been a fish to fry now. And I would also say that whatever differences I have with a Democratic Party that in some respects is much to my left still, the only thing that I care about, I am a one-issue voter, and my issue is democracy. My issue is the survival of democracy. We have only one party that is pro-democracy right now. We have only one party that tries to at least accomplish something. That is not in the business of throwing sand in the gears, that actually wants to pass things and get things done. And so I think we'll have to be a little less picky ideologically while we're in this crisis mode. That the differences between me and Bernie Sanders, me and Joe Biden, pale in comparison to the differences I have with a party that has gone completely off the rails. And for those of you who know your European history, we're in a mode of we need a national front. And that was essentially everyone from communists up through the center right who organized against the far right. And that's the only way we survive. That's how Macron got reelected, by constructing that kind of coalition. That's how we're going to have to defend election offices and election processes, that there will be plenty of time, I hope, because I hope we'll survive, for us to argue about the ideal tax rate, for us to argue about just how fast we should move in the direction of clean energy, to discuss how much immigration is too much immigration or too little immigration. But for now, we have an overriding obligation, opportunity, and that's to defend democracy. When they organized on the battlefield out there, they weren't arguing policy with their neighbors. They were defending the nation. And to some degree, I feel like we're in that moment now. We're in an all hands on deck, all people on the battlefield of democracy moment. And so ideologically, I'll accept the law. It's just not supported. So I hope that answers, that's a better answer than the first answer.
Hi, so I was just wondering, at least from your perspective, do you think that there's a singular event or policy that has kind of started a sort of domino effect towards this specific brand of authoritarianism and desire for a big, strong man, like you said earlier? Or do you think this has just been kind of the natural role of in the natural process of American democracy?
It's a great question, and a related question is Donald Trump simply the continuation of a Republican Party, or is he sui generis? There have been two good books actually that have been written on the latter question, one by one of my colleagues, Milbank, who goes back to essentially Newt Gingrich as the turning point in American politics, when the politics of personal assassination, of propaganda kind of took hold in the Republican Party, and it really kind of became a blood sport. And I think he makes a very powerful argument to that effect. Other people, David Corn, another writer out there, makes an argument that goes back further than that. Goes back to Nixon, goes back to the Southern Strategy. Or you can make the argument it goes back to the Lost Cause. I think we have always been prone to far right elements in this country. And I think to a large extent, what set this off was actually not an event, but a demographic change. There's a gentleman by the name of Robert P. Jones, and I would so highly recommend you read his books or invite him here. He is himself a Christian evangelical who grew up in the South, and he writes about the mindset, the values of white evangelical Christians. And what he points to is kind of the switch, as you put it, pivotal event, was when white Christian Protestants became a minority. And they were no longer in control of society. Something had been taken from them. That this goes back in his thesis more to a racial turning point and a religious turning point than it does to an economic deprivation or economic dislocation. And one of the things, if you remember, particularly from Trump's first election, remember how much he made of the "we don't say Merry Christmas anymore." I'm sure you all thought, where is this coming from? First of all, people say Merry Christmas all the time. And secondly, what does the president of the United States have to do? That was the ultimate whistle to these people, that we are losing our profile as a Christian nation. And now we have to put up with all these other people who have other holidays. And so we now have to say happy holidays because of all these other people who aren't real Americans anyway, because it's a Christian country. That mindset really kind of took hold as a group of people lost their grip demographically. And by the way, that group is really losing steam demographically because younger whites are not identifying as evangelicals. Lo and behold, even in their younger generation, they are losing adherence. So older people eventually pass on, and younger people, younger evangelicals, do not associate themselves with that philosophy, are more inclined to support gay rights, are more inclined to recognize that climate change is a real thing. So I think if I had to put, a pinpoint on it, it would be the sense in which demography set off a panic attack in certain areas of the country. And that the centrality of race and immigration and replacement theory of all things, replacement theory, that's what we're talking about in the year 2022. Talk about a lost cause, my goodness. Why is that so central? Because it really does come down to that. It comes down to the sense that we have lost something. Something has been taken from us by these people who are not real Americans. And that's what it basically comes down to. So, was John Trump had this kind of feral intelligence about people's weaknesses and about how to be a demagogue? Yes. But if you want to look in the largest sense, it's a race issue that we have never come to terms with as a country, and the shift in demography, which suddenly cast them in a role of the minority.
What do you have to say about some Democratic candidates running ads in the primaries in favor of election denying Republican candidates?
It's a great question. Some of the Democratic organizations, the ECCC, the Democratic Coalition, was trying to push forward far-right Republicans on the theory that, we can beat them in the general election. I think that is a terrible idea. That you are playing with fire. We all thought Trump was beatable. Went to sleep before the outcome on the night of whatever it was, November, 2016, because it would be impossible for Donald Trump to be elected. Do not play with fire. These topics, which I think it morally undermines your message, which is that we have to collaborate together to make sure that these people don't come to power. We're doing our hands for them. There's some chance that they will be elected. So it comes from a philosophy that essentially says, we're going to roll the dice one more time and hope these people lose. And could it work out in a couple instances? It might. I personally would not take that risk again. And I certainly would never take that risk with anybody who is in charge of any aspect of election administration. Never take that position for a governor, secretary of state, a attorney general. It's one thing to have one more money congressman, which is regrettable in the extreme. It's another to wind up helping an election denier get into a position where they can forever destroy our electoral system. So I think that was very ill-advised. I would hope that they don't do it again. And we'll have to wait and see if it backfires big time and any of these people actually get elected.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank you for coming. It's been an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
I have one question and then a suggestion. You mentioned this real divide between the have and the have-nots. And it seems like it's getting greater and greater. And with technology, I don't see how we're going to ever resolve that. My thought, and I'd like your thoughts on this, if we look back in history, when we've had opportunity to work together, for example, the service during World War II, those who have gone to other countries and lived there for a time and learned other cultures. If you talk to many veterans, they will tell you that serving with someone who is different than you changes your whole perspective and you can learn to work together. So I'm wondering what your thoughts or the thoughts of the students here would be about some type of national service. It doesn't have to be military, but it can be in any capacity that after college or at some point, we give a year or two to this country to learn to work with others who are different than us. And with that, I do want to mention something that we are now doing here in Gettysburg. It's our little part. But every Friday from 4:30 to 5:30, we are in front of Doug Mastriano's office and we are holding up our signs to promote democracy. And I will tell you, I'm a conservative Republican. I think I'm afraid of what the far right's doing. So if there are those who would like to join us, provided Lois, our director here, is getting a permit, we're there every Friday, 4:30 to 5:30 in front of Mastriano's office. We have signs, you can bring your own, provided it is appropriate, and what we are advocating is freedom, democracy, and choice. So, but you would answer my question.
Sure,
as far as national service.
You know, John McCain was a very big advocate of this for exactly that reason. And we have limited programs. We have AmeriCorps, we have other programs, but they are not mandatory and they are not widespread. I think the widest that we can possibly make them, the better. And whether that is and we don't know whether this would be constitutional. We just know it's from the Supreme Court. We don't know how it's going to come out, whether that would be constitutional to require a national service. Of course, we would pay people for it. But for example, colleges could require it as a condition of admission or a condition of graduation. Employers could require it. So we don't have to wait for the government to necessarily institute a cultural experiment, a cultural change. And that there could be an association of businesses. If you got the Fortune 500 together, they have all kinds of lobbying groups, all kinds of organizations that combat everything and anything. To have them to pledge that their companies will give preference in hiring to people who have had any kind of national service. That would make a difference. To have colleges require or encourage graduation or elsewhere. I agree entirely that part of the problem is that we have sorted ourselves in such an extreme fashion that we don't live, people with different views. Our circle of friends does not include people who are outside your socioeconomic, level. And no matter how inclusive you think you are, you guys will experience this after you graduate from college. You think how many people are close friends who are not college graduates? And if the answer is not very many, or maybe one or two, we have a problem because most people in this country are not college graduates. And by a lot, only about 30% are college graduates. That comes as a shock to college graduates if they never went to college education because like, holy cow, you know, I don't know anyone who isn't a college graduate. Well, that's the problem. So yes, I think two things. One, some kind of national service. If we can't do it by law, then by social persuasion. And I think the other is we certainly have to do a better job in our education system. That our education, and it's gotten worse apparently during COVID, because they learned nothing for a couple of years there. And I sympathize with all of you who are now entering college and feel like you got half of high school. That we simply have to invest in not only K through 12, but affordable college, affordable community college. And I come back to the fact that we are so ignorant of our own history and our own politics. We make people seeking to be naturalized citizens take a test. How many Americans do you think could pass that test? Probably not many. And it's those sorts of things. There are projects out there. There's a he's a professor at Stanford who has started a citizenship project, which aims to create, sort of the equivalent of Girl Scout and Boy Scout troops that are about citizenship and about democracy and are organizing youth. We need to do more of that, and we need to instill in whatever way we possibly can the values, the understanding of democracy in our history. How much good did Hamilton do to educate people about the founding fathers, about compromise, about our history? We should be giving prizes for people who do that sort of thing and giving grants for people who do democracy education in other ways. I think we really have to get a little bit more creative about this. Not every school is going to be great. Not every teacher is going to be great, but we have such a wealth of talent in mass culture in this country that too needs to be enlisted. So I am a big fan of try everything and try anything, but national service, public education in the way that Gettysburg does public education is, I think, absolutely critical to recovering some sense of shared purpose, national identity, and value in democracy.
I wish I remember the name of the book of the author, but a woman had spent some time with Trump voters in the South, find out why these people who vote for Trump. And she had her idea was, imagine we're all in line to buy tickets, and we're waiting, and then someone gets in front of these people, and then they let someone else in front, and then someone else gets in front, so we're not making any progress. And then that's what these people felt. You say they feel that they've lost in their background, their history of being erased. This was more like, wait a minute, I worked hard, I'm here, and I'm doing, and these people are coming in. Immigrants are coming in, they get ahead of the line. Racial minorities coming in, they're getting ahead of the line. And so that's hard to overcome. But this week, Darrell West, he's at the Brookings Institution. He's written that his feeling was the generational change and the demographic change will overtake this, but it could take 2 or 3 decades. And unfortunately, I personally don't have 2 or 3 decades.
Yeah.
So, as I said, it's always darkest just before it turns totally black. So,
That is unquestionably the truth, that you used to make a very nice middle class living, have a house, have a boat, maybe even have a second house without a college education in this country. That you had a whole fleet of jobs, you had high levels of unionization that allowed whole swatches of the country to live a very comfortable lifestyle. And you may have had wealthy people, but they were closer to the wealth of the average person than the billionaire wealth, who doesn't live in the same place, who doesn't go to the same schools, who don't use the same libraries and parks as the rest of us, who have become a class unto themselves. So it's not only that the rules change in terms of education and the ability to create a middle class lifestyle, but that you had the super rich and you had an internet that constantly bombarded people with images of this, when they have the lives of the rich and famous, but when it's on the internet 24 hours a day about how people got ahead, rich people evading the law, rich people doing whatever, a resentment is going to set in. Now, I do think there are things that we need to do economically to address exactly the issue that we're talking about. And strangely enough, it's making a comeback, unionization, wouldn't you know? And it turns out that these young people, smart whippersnappers that they are self-organizing. That the Starbucks organization campaign is not being run by the AFL-CIO. It's being run by small groups of people who are committed to unionizing, whether it's Apple, Amazon, whether it's Starbucks, and that will, I think, help to some degree. And it will give people a sense that some kind of progress is possible, and that we have to create a economy in which more people have access to a decent standard of living than do now, based upon their educational capacity. There was a statistic I think that Kamala Harris used during the campaign that there are virtually no cities in America where on a minimum wage job you can afford a one-bedroom apartment. What are these people supposed to do? How are they supposed to live? And we all know this phenomenon from our own communities. Policemen can't afford to live in the communities that they police. Teachers can't afford to live in the places that they teach. And that makes a huge difference too. We're talking about social connectivity. Having a police officer who knows nothing other than what he learns on the beat or she learns on the beat about that community is not a good formula for police civilian interaction. And I also think that we have become very comfortable with allowing a very small strata of people to fight wars. And I think we cannot underestimate the degree to which people who we now think of as sympathetic to that side of the equation disproportionately contribute sons and daughters in these wars. That because of the ethic of military service and in rural America in the South, that the number of casualties, the number of permanently disabled people is disproportionately high in those communities. They have sacrificed, and then they say, well, what are you doing for us? And that is not an irrational question. And so in some sense, I think we have to figure out lots of ways to burden share, whether it's for wars, for education, for jobs, and going back to my point about polarization, we can't survive as democracy with this kind of polarization and this kind of otherness where we have no connection, no understanding, no personal association with people who are not like us.
Ms. Rubin, thank you for coming to speak tonight. And I want to get out right in front of it. And I want to say I'm a conservative, but I will not be voting for Donald Trump if he wins the primary. In our country's current climate, I do not believe that two demagogic wrongs make a right. Tonight, I've heard a remarkable ability to project and to use whataboutism to justify the behaviors you seek to condemn. The Atlantic called you a political hack I considered a political hack by an ideologically diverse group of your peers and repeatedly conjured a version of reality that proved decisively wrong. Why should average Americans take you and your allies' policy prescriptions seriously if your colleagues on both sides of the aisles do not.
Oh, gosh, a lot of people read me. Got 700,000 Twitter followers. Got a job at the Washington Post, I guess someone was like this, so that's good enough for me.
So I'll be coming at you from the other side. I am the extreme far left.
But
So my position is, how do we know that we haven't just been carrying the bloated corpse of American democracy all this time? How do we know it wasn't stillborn when it was born from an empty platitude of men who didn't consider Black people to be men who are created equal, who didn't consider women to have the right to vote? How do we know American democracy wasn't stillborn back in the 13 colonies? How do we know that we didn't just beat up its corpse further when we drafted men to go fight in the Vietnam War against people who had nothing to do with their lives? When we passed Citizens United and declared that corporations had more political power than the average man or woman in deciding how they live their lives? How do we know that there is an American democracy left in effect?
it's a great question, well put too. We have never solved our original sin. I would be the first to admit, and I think that's kind of what the beginning premise of my remarks were, that we have never come to terms with race in America. One of my lovely guys this afternoon was making the comparison that we've never adopted, in essence, what they did in Germany after World War II, a curriculum based on recognition of national wrongs and a commitment to correct those. We have never done that. And we, to this day, are overly solicitous of people's feelings, as if feeling bad about something is a reason not to educate you about that. Well, I feel bad about math and lots of other things too. But I completely agree that the original sin of America has never been resolved and continues to haunt us over and over again. What I do believe, however, is that we are capable of improvement, that we are ultimately 2 steps forward, 1 step back, that women did get the right to vote. African Americans did get a civil rights bill and a voting rights bill. But do we move back? Do we regress? Absolutely. Look at what the current Supreme Court has done with voting rights legislation that on its face says something than what they say. It is a constant battle. And we do not have perfect democracy. We don't have a democracy in which we live up to the aspirations of all men are created. Not in Europe. But I think we have, I still believe we have a majority of the country who believes in working towards that. Not to form a perfect union, more perfect union, to move in the direction of greater rights. And you look at the American people, what they're capable of. Did I think going to college that I would live to see the day where gay marriage was constitutionally protected? It may not be for long, but it was constitutionally protected. No, I didn't think so. I didn't think we were capable of that level of inclusivity. And yet we were. So we have many, many problems, and many of them go back to race. But so long as we have people who understand that original sin and are committed to improving, working through, who will not feel prey to the people who don't want to teach history because it's going to upset some other subset of people, then we have some hope. You know, it's the Churchillian phrase, once democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. Well, America is the worst democracy except for most of the others. And we got a lot of work to do. So who vote? But great question, really great question.
Hello, I'm sitting here, and I've come to the realization, that I disagree with almost everything that you have said tonight.
Great,
Which is what America should be about.
absolutely.
It is not though. And for too many years, the Democratic Party has,
Democratic Party, you could call them by the name that they choose for themselves.
that's what I said.
Democratic Party, it's Democratic.
Okay. That party has stomped on the Republican Party, and the Republicans that have been elected to government have been vilified in the very media you work for. And it has become an almost state-run media. Not that the government controls it, but that they are extremely aligned with almost everything that the government says, including changing words, such as the definition of recession we just had, which we are technically in a recession, but now the government says, no, we're not, and then the media just go along with it. This has been continued, and then you had Trump come along, and he was the coroner of what you consider American democracy. He was just the person that came at the end to try to bust it wide open, because Republicans felt that they had no voice anymore, and that the Democrats hated them.
Do you have a question?
I do have a question. Okay, yeah. Where is, you know, the party in power is the Democrat Party,
Democratic Party.
you just changed that. and-
No, it's the name of the party. It's the name of the party.
So
Republicans have misstated their party.
I just called it the Democrat Party.
It's not the Democratic.
No,
It's the
I-
Democratic Party.
I called it the Democratic Party, you then corrected me. It's the
No,
Democrat.
it's the other way around, but fine.
That's what I said the first time, okay? What was it? What about the authoritarian aspects coming from the left wing who control almost every single institution in America? Thoughts on that?
Well, I think the premise is not quite right. We have a media now that is extremely diverse. The largest cable news station is Fox. There are a plethora of conservative outlets, websites. Talk radio has been dominated by the right for my entire life. When Ronald Reagan was president, there were 3 networks. Now there are a bazillion plus the internet. So I think complaining that the quote media is biased disregards the reality, which is that the media is fractured. And by the way, your comment about recession is incorrect. The 2 quarters of recession is informal shorthand. The real definition of recession is set by a group of people of whom essentially do it as an after look back. So some of what you think is being changed may not be changed. It may be a little bit more complicated than you think. I don't see Republicans as victims in any of this. Donald Trump was president for 40 years. George Bush was president for 8 years. If they're victims, I'd like to be a victim too. And they not only pulled this off, but pulled this off without getting the majority of the American people. There's only one president, which was Bush in his second term, that actually got a majority of the votes. And yet they've been able to really dominate the presidency for most of my life, all of their life. So I think the victim thing doesn't really work for Republicans. I think the sense that their feelings have been hurt, that we're not letting them say what they want to do or control any institutions. We have a 6-person majority in the Supreme Court that is extremely conservative. Donald Trump, George Bush 1, Ronald Reagan have appointed the majority of judges in this country, not to mention state court judges. State legislatures in this country are overwhelmingly Republican. So how this is repressive or discriminatory, or how we have made life miserable for conservatives, I just don't see it.
Thank you. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about the media aspect.
Yes.
So I was a journalist in high school and our teacher taught us a lot about, you know, the ethics of journalism, about getting all the perspectives and, you know, how to avoid bias. And then I look at a lot of our professional journalism, as you said, it's very fractured. What, if you see one, how do you see us, like a path to a more,
Shared set of facts, perhaps.
yeah, even-handed
Yes.
media as opposed to some very far right and very far left?
It's a very big problem because people are very committed to their own worldviews. We don't watch the same television, we don't listen to the same news, we don't go to the same websites. The information silos have gotten very, very thick. And you can talk about it, you can try to create some dialogue. You can do what, for example, Pete Buttigieg has been very good at, which is going on a Fox News. And more Democrat, more progressives should do that as well, so that people are at least exposed to views which do not align with their own worldview. The press has many difficulties, and it has a particular difficulty in an era in which the two parties are not engaged in the same thing. The Republican Party is not in the same business that the Democrat Party is. The Republican Party is going about something that is not about legislating, not about a democratic process, but is another animal altogether. And rather than be biased against them, my concern is that we are too often in the effort to treat abnormal things as normal and lies as opinions and points of view as just another way of looking at it. That journalists by training are very uncomfortable to say one side is lying or one side has tried to undermine democracy. There's only one party that has done that in the last 4 or 5 years. It should be pretty obvious. So I think there is a huge problem in defining what it is that journalism is supposed to be doing. There's a wonderful journalism professional and writer by the name of Jay Rosen at NYU, and I would absolutely suggest you read some of the things he's written. He posits that journalism should be on the side of democracy, not Democrat, not Republican, not progressive, not conservative, but affirmatively take the side of democracy. And that would be something different as opposed to being a very neutral. The guy on January 6th at the mall said X, and Congressman XYZ said something different. That it would be an affirmative stance that seeks to preserve democracy, seeks to expand democracy. I don't know if that formula really works. I don't know if it works in all cases. But I do know that journalists are much more sensitive to public opinion than you may think. That if you don't write a drop dead, you're evil kind of email, and you write a polite email, or you write a letter to the editor, there still are such things, letters to the editors, that people listen. And the entire media community is wrestling with these issues. It's not as if they lack any kind of, or all kinds of self-awareness. And goodness knows I'm extremely critical of them as well. But I think we have to decide what are facts, what are opinions. I think the practice of putting analysis on the front page in the news is not a good one. I think it confuses people. I think many of those are indecipherable from well-researched opinion pieces that they should probably go elsewhere in a newspaper or a website formula. But it's a struggle. And I think the problem that we really don't address is the lack of good local media. And this is a huge problem because so much of our politics gets decided in state capitals and other groups. there are many capitals, state capitals, that do not have a local newspaper anymore. That's a disaster for corruption, for special interests, whatever your politics are. And there have been some efforts to fund local media. A group or a outlet like Axios is trying to create a kind of a subset of local Axioses so that they cover things at the state capitol. But that too is a huge problem. And I must say, even the paper that I work with, the Washington Post, does not cover Washington DC very well. Because everyone wants to cover national news. That's where the action is. That's where, you know, the glory is. Well, you know how we get police shootings? Go report on the local police department. You know how we get gerrymandered districts? Go report on the state legislatures. Carry the debates that are going on now in state legislatures on abortion bans. You'll be shocked, by the way, at the level of discourse. But the point is they kind of escape scrutiny because there is no coverage of them or very little coverage of them. So we have a lot of problems, but they are solved by good people going into journalism, educated people going into journalism. For God's sakes, don't go to journalism school, it's a waste. Get a degree in something of substance, master a topic, and then go report on it. And remember, news is a lot more than politics and domestic foreign policy. Medical reporting, science reporting, business reporting, labor reporting, all of this is absolutely vital and has really been underserved in a lot of respects. So more people in journalism, smarter, better people in journalism, more local journalism. Go take an internship at a local paper if you can find one. Also buy news. News is worth something. It is not free. It does not come out of the ether. So pay for a subscription to a newspaper online. You don't have to deal with newsprint, you can just subscribe, and some of the rates are pretty cheap. And if you're a student, they're even cheaper. So if everyone in this room subscribed to a newspaper, we have better coverage. Because they would have more funds, they would have more reporters, they would have more pressure on them from people in this room to report accurately and to report well on subjects.
We've gone past the time, I promised this would end at 8:30. Thank you. Students, you get a book. So please come here, get in line. If the book is not available, then come talk to me and we'll make sure you get one. Okay. Carl, I'm sorry. Carl had a question. I'm sorry to you too, but go get in line and ask him. Thank you for the great comments.
I'm very happy. Gotta let them just. These sections. Yeah.
Yeah, but I haven't really worked left for it.
Yeah.